So we are now on to chapter 10, which is all about tobacco. The learning objectives are to describe how Europeans spread tobacco use around the world, to explain the historical importance of tobacco to Canada, to summarize the history of anti-tobacco efforts, to explain the difficulties in marketing safer cigarettes as related to government regulations, to list the most important adverse health consequences of smoking and the total annual smoking attributable mortality in Canada, to examine the controversy over secondhand smoke as both a social issue and a public health issue, to describe the effects of cigarette smoking on a developing fetus and a newborn, to describe how nicotine affects cholinergic receptors in the brain and throughout the body, and describe the most common physiological and behavioral effects of nicotine, to describe the roles of counseling nicotine replacement therapy and bupropion in smoking cessation. So really, the tobacco controversy, it's a legal product and it is used by a significant proportion of adults and is the leading cause of preventable death among Canadians. So tobacco use in the Americas was widespread, but was unknown to Europeans until Columbus arrived in the New World in 1942. There were several methods of use. The users took or used snuff, or drank, as they called it, or smoked tobacco. It wasn't until 100 years after Columbus's voyage that tobacco became popular in Europe, where merchants and clergy members who spent time in the Americas first adopted the use of tobacco and chocolate. And they became wealthy and powerful members of society in Europe. Therefore, these substances were associated with wealth and status. So here we have a picture of the tobacco plant, and tobacco was used by indigenous people in North America long before it was introduced in Europe. In 1535, Jacques Cartier encountered people on the island of Montreal using tobacco. So when we talk about early medical uses, the recognition of the potential medical uses of tobacco grew during the middle of the 1500s. The French physician Jean Nicot sent glowing reports to the French court, and he received credit for introducing the plant to Paris. Linnaeus named the plant genus Nicotiana after him, and the active ingredient was then named nicotine. In the 16th and 17th centuries, we viewed tobacco as having many positive medical uses, but also having a negative reproductive effect, now verified as true. And, based on growing negative findings, nicotine was dropped from the U.S. Pharmacopoeia in the 1890s. So Canada has 3 major tobacco companies founded in the 19th century in Montreal. The Imperial Tobacco Canada Limited, Rothmans, Benson and Hedges Incorporated, and JTI McDonald Corporation. And about 90% of the tobacco grown in Canada is produced in a highly concentrated area in southwestern Ontario. The remainder is grown in Quebec, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. So the popularity of chewing tobacco gradually increased and annual production in Canada peaked in 1980. Now, smoking did not surpass chewing until the 1920s. Chewing slowly declined through the early part of the 20th century. And chewing tobacco remains as big a part of the Major League Baseball today. There is a push to ban chewing tobacco on and off the field, both for the health of the players and to promote them as positive role models for young fans. When we look at cigars, it's a combination of chewing and smoking. It peaked in popularity in the 1920s. As sales increased, so did the cost. Lower cost and changing styles led to the emergence of cigarettes as the leading form of tobacco use. So Native Americans used thin reeds filled with tobacco. So factories appeared in the 19th century to emulate that same way of smoking tobacco, and the habit widely spread with the advent of inexpensive machines that produce cigarettes. So the years from 1920 to 1950 were 3 golden decades for cigarette consumption in Canada. Cigarettes were custom packaged and shipped to Canadian soldiers overseas. And the McDonald's Tobacco created a series of cards that were distributed to Canadian soldiers and organizations to support the consumption of McDonald's tobacco. The card showed here told families and organizations how they could order cigarette packages to be shipped to Canadian soldiers overseas. And we see $1 would send 300 and $2.50 sends 1,000, which is, quite inexpensive when we consider what cigarettes are today. So when we look at, tobacco and how it became more under attack, the long and slowly developing attack on tobacco as a major health problem had its seeds in reports in the 1930s and 1940s, indicating a possible link between smoking and cancer. The 1952 article in Reader's Digest called Cancer by the Carton drew public attention to the issue and a temporary decline in tobacco sales. In response to early reports of health risks, mass marketing of filter cigarettes and with cigarettes with lower tar nicotine content began. It was promoted as a safer alternative, but marked in ways that avoided any indication that the original cigarettes were unsafe. In 1964, there was a Surgeon General's report that stated that smoking causes lung cancer in men. And so tobacco sales began a decline that has continued. In 1965, cigarette packages were required to include a Surgeon General's warning. In 1971, all TV and radio advertising of cigarettes were then banned. And in 1989, smoking was banned on domestic airline flights. So when you think about it, 1989 was not that long ago for some of us. Many additional provincial, territorial, and local bans also passed in 1989, and that momentum is behind efforts to restrict smoking and exposure to secondhand smoke. Almost 6,300 non-smokers die each year in Canada from exposure to secondhand smoke. So here we have that Reader's Digest. It was Roy Noir's article in the December 1952 issue of Reader's Digest called Cancer by the Carton, and it highlighted 30 years of research that linked cigarette smoking with lung cancer. And it was originally published in the October 1952 issue of the Christian Herald. And you can see here the trends in cigarette sales in Canada, and you can see in 2001 in cigarettes, and this was in billions, 45 billion in 2001, and it's now down to just below 30 billion in 2015, and that trend has continued to decline over the years. And so, Canada is now considered to be at the forefront of anti-smoking legislation. In 1908, the Tobacco Restraint Act was passed in Canada, banning sales of cigarettes to those younger than 16 years of age. And this act, although this act was never enforced, and that link between smoking and lung cancer was established in the medical literature in the 1950s. But the tobacco industry casted doubt and made great strides to publicly hide the negative health effects of tobacco. In 1974, the Canadian Council on Smoking and Health was formed. And then also in 1974, the Non-Smokers' Rights Association was formed. And then 1988 to 89, federal laws were enacted to prohibit tobacco advertising and ensure smoke-free workplaces. In 1989, the government also began requiring cigarette manufacturers to list the additives and their amounts in each brand. So when we look at, some of the, this was on the School Drug Education and Road Aware, SEDARA, and it looks at some of the harmful chemicals. We're talking about benzoiodine, arsenic, acetone, lead, formaldehyde, turpentine, butane. All of these things were in cigarette smoke, and cigarettes. And so, in 1989, the government also began requiring cigarette manufacturers again to list those additives and the amounts that were in each brand. Then in 1989, the Tobacco Products Control Act was enacted, and that prohibited all tobacco advertising requiring health warnings on tobacco packaging and restricted promotional activities, and it came into effect at that time. Then in 93, a federal law was enacted raising the legal age for buying tobacco to 18. In 2009, Ontario drivers who smoke with children in the car became subject to fines. And in 2010, the sale of flavored tobacco product was banned, and teens are forced to experiment with far less delicious but equally addictive tobacco-flavored tobacco. In 2013, saw the emergence of herbal tobacco-free hookah use, and it's been over 50 years since Canadians received official warnings that tobacco use causes cancer, and its use is still common today. So lower nicotine cigarettes, where people adjust their smoking behavior to obtain a consistent amount of nicotine, example, taking more puffs and inhaling more deeply. Lower tar cigarettes, where the tar is strictly brown material seen on the filter of a smoked cigarette. And it was introduced by tobacco companies. So the question, safer but not safe. It was unclear if lower nicotine and tar cigarettes were safer or if smokers used compensatory behaviors such as just smoking more, inhaling more. So then we're looking at shisha consumption and hookah use. And so hookahs are large, ornate water pipes that were imported from Arab countries. And hookahs produce milder, water-filtered tobacco smoke. And so when we look at a hookah, the smoking time would be 28 to 80 minutes, whereas a cigarette's 5 to 7 minutes. The number of puffs on a hookah is 50 to 200, whereas a cigarette is 8 to 10. So you can see how it can be marketed as safer in a hookah, but then the compensatory behavior would be using it more often to get the same desired effect. And so, tobacco products used in Canada with youths grades 6 to 9 and ages 15 to 19. You can see cigarillos, cigarettes, water pipes, and smokeless tobacco. And you can see that cigarettes are still the highest from 6 to 9, and then age 15 to 19 still the highest. When we look at hookah use in Canada, the figure shows the percentage of students in grade 9 to 12 by province who have ever used hookah or have used hookah in the last 30 days. Okay. And in the last 30 days, 5.39% in Ontario and 14% overall, with Alberta leading with 17.7% who have ever used a hookah. So you can see that it is on the rise, but again, not necessarily healthier. When we look at smoking in Canada in 2017, we look at daily or occasional smokers by age group and sex population with age 12 and over. It is in the 20% for 12 years or older. That's still quite a high percentage, with males still having a higher increase, likelihood of smoking. Earlier on, and then throughout the entire age brackets, you're seeing males still have a higher percentage. In that 20 to 49 tends to be the higher rate of smokers overall, and that declines with age. So when we look at current and daily smoking patterns of Canadians in their teens, age 15 to 17, when we're looking at smoking in the home, someone regularly smokes, you're still looking at, above the 20% mark. You're looking at a lower income having a higher likelihood of smoking. And again, males having a slight lead over individuals, over females for those who smoke. When we look at the smoking prevalence from 1985 to 2012 for Canadians aged 15 or older and youth aged 15 to 19 and then young adults aged 20 to 24, you are seeing from 15 to 19 a decrease. 20 to 24, you are seeing a slight increase from 2013 to 2015. And then, a slight decrease again in the 25 years or older. So still that 20 to 24 bracket still has a higher incidence there when looked overall. And when we look at percentage of Canadians who were current smokers from 2013 and 2015, although this is somewhat dated at this time, in 2013 and with rates slightly increasing in 2015, youth adults were most likely to smoke compared to other age groups. So adolescents 15 to 19 and adults aged 25 years and older were slightly less likely to smoke in 2015 than 2013. In 2015, the percentages of men aged 20 to 24 who smoked daily or occasionally was higher than that for females in the same age group. So here we have, that flavored tobacco and how the industry really kind of preys on individuals. Youth are the target, right? This is a poster that looks, to combat that. So when we look at smoking among First Nations, individuals, prevalence of current smoking among youths aged 10 to 19 in the Oji Cree community of Sandy Lake, Ontario, according to Stats Canada, rates of smoking are highest among First Nations and Inuit youth. And you can see where Canada, the red line there, still on the rise there, but you're looking at a significant, in some 14 to 15, you're looking at 90% current smoking rate. That is very, very, very high. So rates of use for smokeless tobacco increased in the 1970s as smokers looked for a method of tobacco use with a lowered risk of lung cancer, according to the 2017 CTADS. The prevalence of past 30 days smokeless tobacco was 1% for Canadians aged 15 and older, 2% for youth aged 15 to 19, and 1% of young adults aged 20 to 24. So the sales of smokeless tobacco products, specifically different kinds of chewing tobacco, began to increase. So loose leaf tobacco, which was held in the mouth, was usually sold in a pouch. Then you had moist snuff, which is finely chopped tobacco that would be held in the mouth. It is usually sold in a can. And so moist snuff is not snuffed into the nose in the European manner. A small pinch is dipped out of the can and placed beside the gum, often behind the lower lip. So chewing tobacco might not be as unhealthy as smoking it, but smokeless tobacco is not without its hazards. Of most concern is the increased risk of cancer of the mouth, larynx, and esophagus. Snuff and chewing tobacco do contain potent carcinogens, including high levels of tobacco-specific nitrosamines. Many users experience tissue changes in the mouth, with leukoplakia, a whitening, thickening, and hardening of the tissue, which is a relatively frequent finding. And then lastly, dental disease. So smokeless tobacco, packages now do carry warning labels. So more recently, there has been a much greater increase in the use of e-cigarettes. When we look at this chart for e-cigarette use among Canadians youth 15 to 19, you see a re-emergence. And, a lot of individuals have said this is the cigarette companies rebranding of using nicotine and e-cigarette, in a different way. But then still potentially has effects. And, the popularity of e-cigarettes has increased since the 1990s. And here again, you see that chart of just an increase, of those. And, when we look at the prevalence in the past 30 days of various tobacco products by age group in 2015, again, you're seeing an increase, mostly in the 20 to 24 range, but still quite a high level there. And so the question is, are cigars back? After many years of declining popularity, cigar smoking reappeared on the cultural scene in the mid-1990s. And cigarillos and flavored cigarettes have also become popular in Canadian youth. In 2017, 2% of Canadians aged 15 years and older reported smoking any type of cigar in the past 30 days. And the prevalence of past 30-day use was 3% among youth aged 15 to 19, 5% among youth aged 20 to 24, and 2% among adults aged 25 years or older. And so cigarettes and flavored cigarettes have also become popular with Canadian youth. So when we look at adverse health effects, every 11 minutes, a Canadian dies from tobacco use, approximately 47,000 people per year. So tobacco company tactics contributed to the delay in acceptance of scientific evidence linking smoking and cancer. So when we look at lung cancer, about 85% of all lung cancer occurs in smokers. When we look at cardiovascular disease, accounts for approximately 30% of deaths attributed to smoking. And so the risk increases for those who start young, smoke many cigarettes, and continue to smoke for a long time. So smoking is the single greatest avoidable cause of cancer and death. So we look at here, heart disease, lung cancer, lung disease, and other cancers. Canadian deaths caused by tobacco use, it is very high. And you can see heart disease, lung cancer, and lung disease being the lead, and then smoking, secondhand smoke, causing less, but still quite high. And you can see here where we have statistics where show that when you start and for how long and how many per day increase, the probability of death from cancer by smoking. 85% of all lung cancer occurs in smokers. Cancer-causing agents of tobacco is not nicotine but aromatics such as benzocaine, and they damage DNA, causing cancerous mutations. So every 11 minutes, a Canadian dies from tobacco use. That stat, 47,000 people per year. And 11,000 of those deaths are related to heart disease or stroke. So, when we look at passive smoking, we have to look at, really secondhand smoke. It's the components of environmental tobacco smoke. There's, side stream smoke, the smoke rising from the ash of a cigarette, and mainstream smoke, the smoke exhaled by the smoker. And an epidemiological study published in 1981 demonstrated the risk of lung cancer was increased in non-smoking Japanese women married to men who smoked when compared to non-smoking couples. An Ottawa server whose lung cancer was attributed to occupational exposure to cigarette smoke was instrumental in convincing the Ontario government to pass the Smoke-Free Ontario Act. And consequently, today, most provinces and territories have laws prohibiting smoking in public conveyances or areas. So here again, the components of environmental tobacco smoke, that side stream smoke, the smoke rising from the ash of a cigarette, and the mainstream smoke, the smoke inhaled or exhaled by the smoker. Cigarette smoking contaminants and pollutants air to smoker and environment. And side stream smoke is higher in carcinogens than is the mainstream smoke delivered to the smoker's lungs. And the health effects are difficult to define but include lung cancer, cardiovascular disease, other adverse health effects, and now many laws and regulations have been passed to protect non-smokers. So under Canadian regulations, at least 1 in 16 different warnings must appear. One of the 16 different warnings must appear on cigarette packages. And Health Canada is proposing larger warnings with pictures, hoping to provoke greater emotional responses and better communicate health risks in hopes that tobacco users will be motivated. So, when we look at smoking in pregnancy increases the risk of miscarriage, low birth weight, and SUDS, sudden infant death syndrome. Later effects on physical and intellectual development can happen. An increased risk of neurological problems with certain reading and mathematical skills, and hyperactivity have all been linked to smoking in pregnancy. The effects are of the same type of magnitude of those who were reported for crack babies, as they were called, and many more pregnant women smoked than used cocaine. So when we look at nicotine pharmacology, nicotine is a naturally occurring liquid alkaloid that is colorless and volatile. The tolerance and dependence can develop very quickly. There is high toxicity, typically not delivered fast enough or in a high enough dose to be lethal. The lethal dose would be 60 milligram. But a cigar contains twice that much. So when we look at nicotine absorption and metabolism, inhalation is very effective. 90% of inhaled nicotine is then absorbed. And nicotine is highly toxic, but typically isn't delivered fast enough or in a high enough dose to be lethal. So again, 60 milligrams is a lethal dose, and a cigar contains twice that much. Most nicotine is deactivated in the liver. 80 to 90% is modified before excretion through the kidneys. And the use of nicotine increases the activity of liver enzymes responsible for nicotine deactivation, a process that may help produce tolerance. So nicotine mimics acetylcholine. Okay, it first stimulates and then blocks certain cholinergic receptor sites. So nicotine causes the release of adrenaline and has an indirect sympathogenic effect. So nicotine stimulates, then blocks some sensory receptors. The symptoms of nicotine poisoning: low level, nausea, dizziness, and general weakness, often experienced by beginning smokers. And at higher levels, tremors, convulsions, paralysis, and breathing muscles, and then ultimately death. So when we also continue to look at the physiological effects, the central nervous system and circulatory systems are affected with an increased heart rate and blood pressure, an increased oxygen need of the heart, a decreased oxygen carrying ability of blood leading to shortness of breath, an increased platelet adhesiveness, thereby promoting clotting, and an increased electrical activity in the cortex. And lastly, there is reduced hunger, probably due to inhibition of hunger contractions, and increased blood sugar, and deadening of taste buds may also slightly increase metabolic rate. So here we have again the summary of the physiological effects of nicotine on various organs, the blood, the lungs, muscular system, gastrointestinal, joints, endocrine, the heart, and the central nervous system are all affected. So when we look at drugs and death, a possible new painkiller, one of the early uses of tobacco was as a painkiller. Nicotine itself does have some analgesic properties, but its toxicity limits its usefulness for this. The discovery of the pain-relieving substance in the skin, or the poison arrow frogs that bind strongly to nicotine acetylcholine receptors, has led to the development and testing of several new nicotine analogs. Side effects such as nausea and dizziness have been a problem, and it remains to be seen whether a related drug will someday be available for pain relief. So when we look at behavioral effects, nicotine is the primary reinforcement substance in tobacco. And, smokers report that nicotine has both stimulant and calming effects, and user expectations probably play an important role in this. Smokers are able to sustain their attention to a task requiring rapid succession of information from a computer screen much better if they're allowed to smoke before beginning. And so, nicotine produces a beneficial effect on this performance, or prevents withdrawal symptoms during the task. So it's one or the other. And I would probably side with the last one. The withdrawal symptoms allow the individual to concentrate a little bit better. So the debate continued despite conclusions made by the Surgeon General's report. Cigarettes and other forms of tobacco are addictive, and nicotine is a drug in tobacco that causes addiction. So the processes that determine tobacco addiction are similar to those that determine addiction to drugs like heroin and cocaine. So nicotine affects dopamine in the nucleus accumbens and the mesolimbic system, which underlies the subjective reinforcement effects of nicotine. And the brains of chronic nicotine smokers also show a large reduction in monoamine oxidase, an enzyme responsible for breaking down the neurotransmitter dopamine. So slowing the breakdown of dopamine might therefore enhance the effects of dopamine release by each acute dose of nicotine, and perhaps contribute to the strength of the dependence on nicotine experienced by smokers. And so researchers have begun to focus on the role of genetic differences and whether people develop dependence or remain occasional smokers. So the question remains how to stop smoking. And, in 2007, Health Canada approved varenicline, which stimulates the nicotinic receptor or on dopamine neurons, and it mimics the effects of nicotine to reduce cravings. And there are some challenges to quitting. Nicotine is strongly a reinforcing drug. A pack-a-day smoker puffs at least 50,000 times a year. And the 6 month relapse rate from smoking cessation is extremely high, 70 to 80%. So individuals will relapse several times on average before they actually stop. So varenicline, or Champix, was approved in 2007 by Health Canada. And it is a nicotine partial agonist drug. And what it does, it really mimics the dopamine neurons, mimics the effects of nicotine to reduce cravings. And it partially blocks the receptor, preventing nicotine from binding to it, resulting in a weaker response in the people who give in to temptation or have a cigarette. So nicotine from a cigarette stimulates the release of dopamine, a substance produced by the body that triggers feelings of pleasure. And when a smoker quits, the lack of nicotine leads to reduced levels of dopamine, causing feelings of cravings or withdrawal. And so, when you take that drug, Champix, it both blocks the nicotine receptors, reducing the addictive power of the drug, and triggers moderate dopamine release to alleviate some of that withdrawal symptoms. Zyban was also an antidepressant drug that has been shown to help with smoking cessation. Okay, and again, that Champix, it appears that this drug may be slightly more effective than Zyban in long-term quitting rates. So Health Canada has issued a warning about heart-related side effects in people with cardiovascular disease who use Champix. So there is some side effects. And so combining counseling and pharmacological treatments do increase the odds of quitting. So smokers who want to quit should keep trying. It often takes multiple attempts, and it is likely that by trying different approaches, an individual, effectively one will be found for the individual. So some of the, in summary, tobacco was introduced, to Europe and to the East after Columbus's voyage to the Americas. As with most other new drugs, Europeans either loved tobacco and prescribed it for all ailments or hated it and considered it responsible for many ills. In its original form, tobacco was used in ceremonies for the medical attributes by indigenous peoples, and by 1800, tobacco was being commercially grown in Canada. In 1912, the Imperial Tobacco Company of Canada was incorporated to produce and market tobacco products across Canada. In 1952, the article in Reader's Digest called Cancer by the Carton drew public attention to the issue and led to a temporary decline in cigarette sales. In 1988 to 1989, federal laws were enacted to prohibit tobacco advertising and ensure smoke-free workplaces, and the government began requiring cigarette manufacturers to list additives on packages. The Tobacco Products Control Act, prohibiting all tobacco advertising, required health warnings and tobacco packaging and restricted promotional activities. In 1993, the legal age for buying tobacco was raised to 18. In 1994, bigger and stronger warnings messages became required on cigarette packs. In 1997, the Tobacco Act imposed general restrictions on manufacturers and distributors, restricted promotion, packaging, and products, and imposed point-of-sale restrictions. Tobacco companies responded by forming a supposedly independent council for tobacco research to look into the health claims, but later investigations revealed this council was not independent of tobacco company influence. They also mass-marketed filter cigarettes and cigarettes with lowered tar and nicotine content. Around the mid-1950s, tobacco companies began to promote the idea of a safer cigarette, although safer does not mean safe. Tobacco companies have tried to promote the idea of a safer cigarette with a filter, without actually admitting that there was anything unsafe about their older products. So the typical modern cigarette is about half as strong in tar and nicotine content as a cigarette of 50 years ago. Cigarette smoking has declined considerably since the 1960s, but about 20% of young people still become regular smokers. So the use of smokeless tobacco increased during the 1980s, causing concerns about increase in oral cancer. And although tobacco continues to be an important economic factor in North American society, it is also responsible for more annual deaths than all other drugs combined, including alcohol. Cigarette smoke is clearly linked to an increased risk of heart disease, lung and other cancers, heart disease, and stroke. And tobacco use kills 47,000 Canadians each year. And there has been increased concern about the health consequences of passive smoking, and it has led to many more restrictions on smoking in the workplace and in public. Almost 6,300 non-smokers die each year in Canada from exposure to secondhand smoke. And on average, infants born to smokers are lighter, shorter, smaller, and have a smaller head circumference than the infants of non-smokers. There are differences in body size, neurological problems, reading and mathematical skills, and hyperactivity are apparent. Smokers have more miscarriages really than non-smokers. So nicotine is a central nervous system stimulant. It mimics acetylcholine by acting on several nicotinic subtypes of cholinergic receptor sites and blocks the transmission of information at the synapse. Nicotine causes a release of adrenaline. It causes vasoconstriction in the skin. It increases heart rate and blood pressure. It increases platelet adhesiveness. It inhibits hunger, contractions of the stomach, and decreases the oxygen carrying ability of the blood. And really, smoking cessation leads to immediate improvements in mortality statistics, and new products, including different types of nicotine replacement therapy in combination with counseling, are being widely used by those who want to quit.